Good morning, March 18th, and I want to continue with the exploration of cosmology of light, and today specifically explore the architecture of possibility. I'm going to build off the exploration of the last few weeks and essentially just recap the seed equation and recap the notion of quantization. But then I also want to look at, when we talk about the architecture of possibility, consider Schrodinger's equation, wave equation, and some other forms of it. So recall that the kind of root of the cosmology of light is when we consider light moving at an infinite speed, it gives rise to a reality which is pronounced by four principles, if you will: presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. And when we consider light moving at 186,000 miles per second, that creates this reality. It creates a reality in which we have a physical, vital, mental, and connection. And we find that there's a symmetry between this depiction of reality and this depiction of reality, which gives insight into the notion of light when viewed from different points of view. And completing this notion of the seed equation, we can mathematically transform this reality into this reality, creating different views of this symmetry that underlies the properties in light. So if we consider an intermediate plane where light is moving at a speed k, and another plane where light is moving at the speed n, where n is between 186,000 miles per second and k is between n and an infinite speed, then essentially what we had posited was that at this k we can have sets of presence, a set of power, set of knowledge, set of harmony, which would essentially be sets of infinite elements. And then at n we have the basis of uniqueness, which is an infinite number of unique seeds that create the reality of the material diversity that we experience here. When light is traveling at 186,000 miles per second, we depict this infinite set of seeds just simply by the multiplication of these four sets: the set of powers, set of presence multiplied by set of power multiplied by set of knowledge multiplied by set of harmony. And then we had posited that essentially the reality at Cu is a function of the reality at Cn, and similarly the reality at Cn is a function of the reality at Ck, and similarly the reality at Ck is a function of the reality at C infinite. And this was the seed equation, and one of the characteristics of this is that whereas things show up materially at this layer U, we had posited that they show up as a wave here, as a field here, and as a block over here, essentially creating the paradigm that we have a quadrality that informs every space-time instant and not just a wave-particle duality. Now, when we talk about the architecture of possibility, we're essentially going to leverage off this equation here, and keeping in mind that this is considered to be reality, and this, everything else is emergent from this. So when we talked about quantization and essentially how things show up materially, there is a scheme of quantization whereby the layers of light behind can accumulate what the essence of is going to be expressed materially, and that accumulation of the essence is basically what results in quantization. So packets of light that then become matter. And we had also posited that quantization is a multidimensional scheme. It's not just about energy converting into matter, but there's also quantization along the space, time, gravity dimensions, in addition to the energy dimension that's already considered and has mathematically been equated to Planck's constant h. So we had posited from previous discussions that we have therefore multiple Planck's constants, a Planck's constant for space, a Planck's constant for time, for gravity, and of course what's already known as a Planck's constant for energy. Now this is in a sense how things materialize according to this scheme, but if we consider the prevalent view in quantum physics, then one of the first schemes is that of Schrodinger's equation, and here we have IH 2 pi and the rate of change, if you will, of psi that equals to the previous wave function times a focusing function, the Hamiltonian. And some of the key features of this are essentially you're connecting the material layer with some layers behind it, so being consistent with this scheme of multi-layers, there's, in this view, Planck's constant is emergent and is determined by the speed of light and the relation between layers of reality at different speeds of light and 186,000 miles per second. And when we're talking about a wave, we see here that h is being reduced by a fraction, which means that light is essentially traveling faster. So there's a consistency, if you will, between this framework and this framework. And then whatever manifests materially, so the rate of change of the manifestation is consistent or dependent on the previous or the entire possibility of the wave function that exists, which is essentially everything behind this material layer here. And this focusing function, Hamiltonian, is in a sense a function of these layers that exist behind this material layer. So that's one depiction of the architecture of possibility. Now when we talk about a second depiction of the architecture of possibility, it can be built of Euler's function. So we have EIX, so there's, we may say that what manifests is a function of Euler's function, but let's explore this a little more. We know that e to the ix is depicted by cosine x I sine x, which when you look at it, it essentially describes a sinusoidal wave, and if you bound that within 0 and 1, you have all the possible probabilities adding up to 1, meaning that whatever is possible behind the surface, there'll be one thing that will manifest. And so here's another scheme of the architecture of possibility that's tied to probabilities. And if you want to elaborate this a little further, so we may say that psi is proportional to E. So we can, instead of using this notation of the rate of change of psi, we can use an integral notation, which means for all space and time, we add up all possibilities, and further, all those possibilities will kind of fluctuate between some bound, and we can depict that by another integral x. So we have this kind of second notation of the architecture of possibilities, and I want to explore a third notation that kind of builds on this. But here we're going back to the seed equation. When we speak about the seed equation, what we're talking about is the layers of reality that exist behind or inform this material layer of reality. And in order to kind of feel those layers or activate them in material existence, a way to think about it is that, so this describes some kind of a light matrix, but we could similarly have a space matrix in which these seeds that we had explored over here express themselves through some kind of a maturity in time, but the seeds exist as infinite variety in space, and we can depict this by saying that there's an untransformed layer in which there's many dynamics along 4 different dimensions. We depict that by a small x, where x really relates to this one of these 4 dimensions over here, and I've explored this in other videos, so I'm not going to go in detail over here. But it all comes down to a notion of breaking existing patterns that exist in this untransformed layer. When we break these patterns, that's depicted essentially by being able to exceed the patterns that exist along these dimensions. We break into another dimension, let's call it meta level 1, in which the dynamics are more to do with the signatures along these different dimensions, and then when these signatures become forces or become prevalent, we essentially break patterns that exist here to enter into this reality, in which the more fundamental sets, the properties in the sets, become more real. And when these sets tend to become integral, then we break the pattern, if you will, and enter into from M2 to M3. So moving from M1 to M2, these sets become forces. Moving from this layer to this layer, we break patterns so that these forces become more integral. And then essentially at this layer, we have entered into this fourfold ever-present quality that exists at every point, if you will. So we may just depict that as system X. So we have this scheme of the maturity of seeds, and we have also a matrix, I'll just call it time, that describes when these kind of layers, if you will, M3, M2, M1, and U become active. And we can propose in this layer that M3 is active for all time and beyond time. And again, I'm not going to go into the details here, but the question is, when is M2 active? And M2, we can propose, since it's the enhancements of these sets, that it certainly is active at a time greater than 0 and to infinity. And then M1, we can say, is active at a time later than this, because we're talking about the creation of unique seeds. So we may depict that at greater than or equal to time, the time over here, but also within the bound infinity. And the U, in terms of when does this layer become active, we may draw a separation between the reality of cellular life versus human life, and say that at human life, this notion of will and breaking patterns is more important. So time works in such a way that there's a maturity that works from U integrating into M3, and at the level of cell and before, we have the opposite dynamic, where there's an automaticity that expresses itself at this quote-unquote untransformed layer, so it moves in the other direction. So essentially, using this light space time matrix, we may modify this depiction here and say that the architecture of possibility is determined by this integral E, and then the integral LST, where LST represent the light space and time matrix. And essentially then all possibility fluctuates between these bounds from 0 to 1 from a probabilistic scheme, but is determined by the dynamics of these layers here. But I would argue that there's a simpler way to depict the architecture of possibility, This kind of movement from Schrodinger's equation to taking Euler's and Pythagoras' theorem, if you will, to depict probabilities, to this notion is all kind of developed from Schrodinger's equation. But if, however, you take this light space and time matrix and you allow it to iterate so that you have here at the untransformed layer some kind of set that is relatively untransformed, but through the action of these components here, there's some kind of a transformation and it becomes relatively transformed, then you can iterate this whole thing so that the next xu that you iterate is basically derived from the previous xt, and we can depict that through this. So essentially this means that there's an iterative function in which the basis of materialization is more advanced than it was previously. And in this kind of depiction, there's probably a fourth scheme that would summarize the architecture of possibility, and that we could simply, we may call it emergence, is equal to basically the product of the light space time matrix that is iterated such that xu becomes is based on the previous xt, and this whole thing is iterated such that n proceeds from some constant, say from 1 to infinity. So that's another way to really depict the architecture of possibility.